And sometimes people try to say, oh, but I'm fighting for gender equality, or I'm fighting against racism. That has nothing to do with capital. And I think for left to be successful, you need to develop a project which realizes that if you fight against capital, that also has to include a fight against racism and for gender equality. We need to acknowledge there is a crisis, not just of neoliberalism, but I think there's a capitalist crisis, and that is expressed in this, what David Harvey refers to as a crisis of overaccumulation. So there's lots of private capital sloshing around in the global system, desperately trying to find profitable investment opportunities where to land. Yeah? Because from a capitalist point of view, you constantly have to invest to make yet more profit. And so there we have the capitalist crisis. Now, is neoliberalism the answer? I think it depends a bit also on the question for whom. So in Europe, for example, we had in the Greek context and the Eurozone crisis, we had a very neoliberal, austerity-focused response. That resulted in selling off national companies, Greek telecommunications, for example, postal services, railways, ports, has all been privatized. So that was a profitable investment opportunities for private capital. Now, did it work to solve the crisis? Well, if one looks about the Greek health education system, it certainly didn't work. Yeah. Greek people are very much impoverished. They have not benefited from that. But it has allowed capital to continue exploitation at an expanded scale. So they could buy up those national companies, and they have been able to weaken labor further by undermining trade unions in the process. So from a capitalist point of view, neoliberalism works well because it weakens labor and it allows you to find new ways of accumulation. But from the people's point of view, from a worker's perspective, it does not work. If we want to understand what happens now, we need to go all the way back to the 1970s, because there we had already had a worldwide economic crisis, recession. And what happened at the time was that on the one hand, labor-intensive production parts were shifted to the global south. Textile, for example, to Bangladesh, other countries in that area. And on the other hand, in the global north, more and more capital has been shifted in towards finance. So through pure speculation, you make more profits. And of course, so the crisis could be overcome temporarily, but what we face now is that this crisis has resulted in an even bigger crisis, because this kind of accumulated capital still needs to look desperately for profitable investment opportunities. And so at a global level, there is this intensification of the crisis, potentially also resulting now in kind of geopolitical kind of tensions between the United States and China, for example. One way of carrying on accumulating is, well, you can find new markets and cheaper labor, or you make the labor locally cheaper, and you do that by informalizing it. Yeah, so you put the risk from the company onto the individual employee. It becomes ever more precarious. That's the case here, that's the case in Europe, that's the case in North America. And I think what this precarity does, at first, it undermines actually class consciousness as a kind of a collective effort. Yeah, because people become very insecure and vulnerable. And how can you respond to that individually? You do everything to keep your particular employment, yeah, and you're prepared to make concessions. And I think kind of class consciousness can only result as a consequence of concrete struggles. So only when people organize and collectively try to defend, well, they first recognize that they have similar interests and then collectively defend their position. Then as a result of that, you can have a kind of a class consciousness. But the precarity by itself wouldn't give you that. A lot of people talk about this new Chinese economic superpower. Some people even speak about it potentially replacing the United States. I'm a bit more skeptical about that. And I think if we look how China is integrated in the global economy, it's still very much based on cheap labor production. So Chinese cheap labor assembling parts which come in from other parts in Asia, putting it together in iPhones, and then exporting it to North America and Europe. And if you think about this cheap labor basis, then that's actually quite low in the global value chains. That's not a very strong economic position. And there's crisis pressure in China too, and so they think, how can we overcome that? And then they say, okay, let's increase the wages so we have more domestic demand. But the moment they do that, then they're no longer competitive. And some shoe production, for example, has already been shifted to Vietnam, where workers are even cheaper. And then people say, yeah, but hold on a second, don't forget the Chinese kind of development in Huawei, high-speed railway, Lenovo, computers. And that's correct. So development is uneven. There are some sectors within which China has actually made quite a bit of advances. I think it's open-ended, but I don't see it as so strong. And what is interesting perhaps is that in China too you have increasing moments of industrial unrest with large amounts of workers going on strike for better wages. This is one of the phenomena we can actually see at the moment here in Brazil, but also in Europe equally, with new right-wing, almost fascist parties playing a more dominant role. And I think it's because of neoliberal restructuring undermining people's livelihood. When people have their livelihood endangered, I think they become also open potentially for right-wing rhetoric and right-wing discourses. In Great Britain, where I come from, with the whole Brexit discussions, there's pressure on the labor market, and a lot of people say, oh, it's all these Polish workers who come over and take our jobs. It's not the case, we know that, but people become vulnerable to fall for these right-wing ideologies. And I think the problem is, in Europe, there is no coherent left-wing project which could provide an alternative for these people to rally around. And that's the biggest challenge. Yeah. I think when we look at the situation globally and in various national contexts, the left is very much on the defensive, struggling to find an alternative at this moment in time. I think there's some unity, probably even here in Brazil, amongst left-wing forces. There's some unity of opposition against Bolsonaro. But what you want to put in place instead of the agenda he represents, I think there's a lack of unity. And in Europe we have very much the same, whether at national level or at the European level. There's no clear alternative what we could propose as a way of mobilizing people around it. So you first of all need a project, and then you also need the forces who could actually organize within society around that kind of alternative project. But I think both is needed. This financial class, they don't directly control the means of production, but of course at the same time, partly through big pension funds which look for profitable investment opportunities, they still rely on concrete production, producing commodities, in order to reap those profits as a result of their investments. So I still think it's, in a way they are separate, but in a way they are also directly involved in the material production of goods and depending on it. And in that respect, I think a class struggle is still its usual form of capital against labor. So I think in that sense it hasn't changed. What has always changed is that, of course, we are also fragmented and there are other important issues. So there's also oppression along racial lines and there's oppression along patriarchal gender lines. And sometimes people try to say, oh, but I'm fighting for gender equality, or I'm fighting against racism. That has nothing to do with capital. And I think for left to be successful, you need to develop a project which realizes that if you fight against capital, that also has to include a fight against racism and for gender equality. We have a core and periphery, but perhaps not in world systems terms, where countries are rigidly locked geographically in a kind of a global political economy. But I would argue that capitalism always develops in an uneven and combined way. And that does mean that you have certain concentrations of wealth, perhaps around more high capital-intensive production, and then you have regions in the global economy around labor-intensive production in the periphery. But I think importantly, you have also got a situation where even in the kind of geographical core in Europe, you have the emergence of this kind of peripheral, atypical, insecure employment contracts. So you have now Foxconn, which is used to produce in China based on cheap labor. They also produce in various Eastern European countries based on cheap labor there. Yeah? So in a way you have the kind of periphery emerging in the core. And I think even here, when you look around in Sao Paulo, you also have the core, yes, a group of the very rich who live very similar lives as would be the very rich in Paris or London. Yeah? So you have a core and a periphery, but it's much more diverse now across the global economy. Their life experience is similar to other people in the core, and they are crucial in the way they organize capitalism in a more peripheral setting, so that it's closely integrated with and at the service of the kind of more core regions in the world. I think about the heavy focus of Brazil on the export of primary commodities, be it in the agribusiness sector, be it the extractivist industries with oil and minerals. That's a kind of a more peripheral situation, but then you need people who organize that in relation to the global economy.